Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox. I'd like to welcome you to episode 140 of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. Today it is my distinct pleasure to have Leona Lewis visit with us. Leona is a former compliance practitioner and attorney at Best Buy with a wide range of compliance experience, and she's recently opened up her own consulting company, Compliance Ethic. The interview comes in at just over 26 minutes, and she has some really interesting insights from her days in retail into the compliance realm. I hope you enjoy it. Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm Tom Fox, and welcome to this episode of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. Today I have with me Leona Lewis. Leona is she's going to tell us what she's doing now, but she has played in the compliance space for many years, and she's recently opened up her own compliance consulting company. She's got a fascinating background and doing some really interesting things. And so I asked her if she might be able to come on the podcast and tell us what she's up to, and she graciously took some time from her schedule to tell us about what is going on in the Great White North. So with that, from a rainy Houston to, I think you're in Minneapolis.
Yes, I am. But we're no longer the Great White North. We're going to reach about 63 degrees today, so we're all euphoric here in Minneapolis.
That's warmer than it is in Houston. So, Leona, you were in compliance with a little bit different focus than my type of compliance, but at a company that most folks have heard of if they haven't actually shopped at, Best Buy. So I was wondering if you could tell us about your compliance experience at Best Buy.
Sure. I was at Best Buy at first as a contractor for about a couple of years, and then as an employee for 13 years. And during that time, I served a number of different roles. I started in contract negotiations. Then I worked building the loyalty program. And in the process of building the loyalty program, I think I got my first taste of working with the operations of the company in order to achieve what they wanted to achieve with customers, in that the terms of the loyalty program. Like, we would make promises to the customers, and we needed to fulfill them. Then after that, I worked supporting the private label brand program. And at that time, it was about a quarter of the size it is now. Best Buy has one of the most successful private label brand electronics programs in North America in retail. And it was really an ambitious project with a lot of people, a lot of great people that I worked with there. And I think at first, they just thought, well, I was going to do contract negotiations. They really looked at the business in terms of transactions, buying and selling for margin. But it became quickly apparent that really what this was making, again, a brand promise to customers on the quality of product, being able to service that product, and actually the regulatory impact of that product, because we were going to own that brand, and we were going to own the face of that brand to the government as well as to consumers. So that's when I started getting involved in regulatory compliance. In addition to supporting the Best Buy's retail take-back program for electronics. Not everyone knows that Best Buy runs the largest in-store electronics recycling program in North America. So you can take your old electronics to Best Buy and get them recycled. So that actually required, it was a large operation, and it required a lot of risk assessment from my part and some outside experts in doing things that really no company had ever done before.
Leona, if I could stop you there, because I am a very loyal and satisfied customer of Best Buy, in large part because my customer experience has always been very positive. Almost from the minute I walk in the door,
through this marketing process, if I can call it that, to the sales process, to the conclusion of the sales process, to the after-sales process where I would have a product delivered and or set up by my favorite named group, the Geek Squad. And when I thought about that in terms of a process, I began to understand that it appeared to me that someone's thinking through those issues and how to give someone like myself such a positive experience that I would return. Is that right? Is that how you or others at Best Buy might think through that?
I think we would think through that in the normal customer service area. I would say a lot of that really has to do with fostering a culture of customer support, more than it has to do with people thinking through every detail that could happen. So some efforts are inherently decentralized, and I'd say, your experience in the store is one of them, because there's 150,000 Best Buy employees. 95% of those are in the store. And if it weren't for fostering the culture that Best Buy fosters in the store, it would be impossible to give you a consistent experience like that. But some efforts are more centralized, because something like the terms of the loyalty program can't be done 1,000 different times, 1,000 different ways in 1,000 different stores. It can really only be done one way. And so in that instance, the relationship with the customer has to be thought through in detail. But yeah, it's the customer experience that I think really sets Best Buy apart.
Well, how does a company like Best Buy with 150,000 employees all the way from, I would guess, teenagers to folks your and my age who are subject matter experts in a particular product, service, or other, how do you get them moving? How do you foster a culture where someone like me has such a positive experience?
It's not easy. And every retail company has this same problem when you have to find a way to get a message across and procedures across and a communication system to all the stores and all the people in a way that can be executed. That's tough. For example, in the compliance area, working with individual stores on what to do, how to dispose of product, how those processes work in order to reduce risk, how to take recalled product off the shelf. All of those issues can't be vague. They have to be very clear and easy to consistently train. So, which means that it's like in the environmental area, it's extremely hard, and a lot of retailers have struggled with the same issue, to train store employees to recognize what hazardous substances are in a product by the label and be able then to make the appropriate decisions after that, because the turnover in retail is so rapid, and the turnover in retail and products is rapid. So you may have one person coming across this issue once in their time in the store. And because it doesn't happen every day, that makes it much more difficult to train. Now, backing up to the cultural issue, a lot of it has to do with hiring, and I think a consistency that the store managers take in their pride of ownership of the stores that creates that culture. It really is, in compliance we talk a lot about the tone in the middle. And when you're talking about a customer experience, it really does come from the tone in the middle that fosters attracting the right people and also rewards the right behavior.
So you've talked about the hiring process. You've talked about rewarding the right behavior. What about two other areas I'd like to inquire? One is training, and then the second is not sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. That's not the right phrase, but a phrase of where the discipline is enforced by your peer group. So do either of those concepts sort of work in this tone in the middle that you were trying to communicate?
Yeah, I'd like to hear a little more about what you mean about enforce in terms of a peer group.
So if you have 150,000 employee base, some of those people are going to be managers, and I understand that management would commit or leadership will give some general guidelines about the way they like things to go. And but you focused on the middle group, the tone in the middle, as the group that will largely interact with someone like myself as a customer. And so what I'm wondering is, it's one thing for leadership to give a message, but how is the message reinforced by those in the middle to others in the middle?
Sometimes it is by setting those people up for success in that message. Because at a retail store level, every retail store, the management is bombarded with just huge numbers of messages from corporate in various ways. And those managers have to set priorities on how and what they're going to focus on with the employees in the store. Now, there are different ways we can set up for success. One is to make the issue as systematic as possible so very little has to be trained. And success can be measured and tracked. Because if success cannot be measured and tracked, it's hard for anyone to actually make it a priority. Do you understand what I mean?
Absolutely.
Yeah, because you're like measured against all of these things. And so typically, I mean, even you and I would also do the same thing. We would focus on the things we're measured on. And even just for our own self-satisfaction, we would focus on the things we could be measured on so we can see progress, because people like to see progress. The other is if you're going to measure it, is transparency. The understanding that those efforts are going to be seen and reacted to is pretty important. Like those efforts, if a store manager is going to have to train a lot of employees and is going to be measured on the success of the training, then it's important that all of that effort didn't go into a black hole. That they need to know that upper management cares about the results of this. Because, I mean, no one finds it more frustrating than to be tasked to do a lot of stuff and not know what the results, what happened. You know, was this a priority or not? Is it just another thing that you just gave us and then it's going to be ignored?
You know, this is a really interesting discussion. One of the reasons I enjoy these podcasts so much are things go in different directions than I had really not considered. And your entire discussion about messaging, communication of the message, reinforcement of the message, training on the message are really things that I hope that you can really help the anti-corruption compliance community understand through your experience at Best Buy, because that's, I think, one area that we really don't focus on as much, and certainly not as well as the way you have just described it. So kudos for those insights.
Well, thank you. I think in the world of retail, it's a great analogy to just any kind, when you have to train any kind of mass population or a large population that may not have personal connection to you, because you know, in a retail company, you're very concerned about the experience of the employees on the floor. and you're very concerned about every minute they spend in the store. It's the feedback you get in terms of success or failure is a lot faster than I think it probably is in other contexts.
Mm-hmm. Yes. If we could turn now to your new endeavor, which I believe is the company you call Comply Ethic Consulting, LLC. Could you tell us when you started that and what your goals are with that company?
Well, I started that last fall, and I had left Best Buy and really was taking stock of where I wanted to go from here, and really decided I honestly wanted to work with more companies. I had worked for Best Buy for 13 years, and that's really a long time to spend in one organization. And I also had value to people and companies who really couldn't afford to hire somebody like me full time. Like it's pretty unusual, I think, to have somebody who focuses on compliance the way I do full time in many companies, especially smaller ones. But what I'm trying to do is work with the people in companies who end up essentially getting, I would say, saddled with the compliance goals, but with insufficient resources. We, hear all the time how companies, they want to do the right thing, and usually they point at an in-house lawyer and they say, hey, figure this out. But, that person probably doesn't have the experience of building that kind of operation, and also usually has the tendency to get more advice about the law and then advise the business on the law, which is important, but really a compliance program isn't about just giving advice about the law. It's about being able to train the operations to be compliant. And so I come in the sense, what do you do after you know a lot about the law? Like, how do you put this together? And that's something I have a lot of experience in a context that isn't necessarily built to be very concerned about regulatory compliance. I mean, retail companies are traditionally not very highly regulated businesses. And so getting alignment from leadership on actions and resources and compliance was definitely not a given. And so, and in a lot of other businesses, it's the same problem. And I've gone through that learning curve and to be able to work with, especially lawyers, because I essentially am trying to sell to somebody who's like myself, who was in-house and was trying to solve a problem, and a problem that was somewhat unprecedented in the company. And so, and help them, work through and project manage implementation or improvement of their compliance program and, risk assessment of the compliance program. And the different angles you could take. I try to approach this with a lot of compassion for the business people, really, because they all have their own incentives and their own ways of doing things that they believe is correct, and for good reason, because they're doing the jobs they were hired to do. But usually the compliance issues is something they don't necessarily see as their responsibility. And getting the cultural shift towards, wait a minute, it doesn't matter whether I think it's my responsibility, it ends up being my responsibility because due to the operation of law, is a concept that that a lot of people really have to come to. It's not natural. People want to say, well, this is the job I accepted. I accepted this responsibility. And, in a lot of areas in life, that's how it works.
Well, let me stop you there, because you have written a blog post entitled Leadership Most Critical to Success of a Compliance Program. And so don't leaders understand their role in an overall compliance program, even if it's to be an ambassador, or is that something that you found you really need to educate leaders on?
that's something I found really needs to be educated on leaders.
Okay.
It's not a compliance team can make compliance a lot easier and measurable and executable. Like the compliance team's job is to support the leaders and the operations compliance, and also provide a certain level of checks and balances, because then you have someone with authority to make decisions about compliance who's not incentivized by the results of the business. But really, the operations themselves have to comply. It's businesses comply with the law, not compliance teams. Like, it's not the compliance team who complies with the law. It's really the business who does it.
Right.
And that's an educational process. And it usually becomes a lot more clear once you have a specific example of something that will impact the operations that the leaders need to think about. That this isn't a situation where we can file paperwork or check a checklist and then it'll be done. It's an ongoing process.
How are you or others on your team able to communicate that to the leadership at Best Buy, or had that been done by the time you got there?
Some of that had been done, and in some areas, it just took a while, because the other problem is that in a lot of companies, you may have a compliance issue and nobody in the company is responsible for managing that problem. And I don't mean the compliance problem. I mean, even the business problem that this impacts. So, in some retail companies in particular, you might not have somebody who is in fact in charge of dealing with their supply chain flexibility. That means that they would have to have a compliance program that reached to all different kinds of business groups than it does now. I mean, do you understand what I mean?
Sure.
Like you could have purchasing that purchases directly overseas, or purchases locally, or purchases from distributors, or purchases from, or makes its own product, or puts product together, or makes kits with different organizations and puts them together. Well, if you really want fast choice between all the options you could have in sourcing, you have to have a way of not only assessing but dealing with the different risk profiles of those business arrangements, because they're not the same.
Sure. Including
the compliance area. And often what ends up we call compliance when we're talking about regulations is the same, is really close to the same functions as things like quality or specifications or making sure you have expectations or checking. It usually can be, it's something that can be embedded in a lot of the other areas that the business is already concerned about. So the other message to leaders is that compliance isn't necessarily a separate issue from your existing. It's not that you want to have a parallel process that only deals with regulatory issues. But you may want to have a parallel group of decision makers that deals with regulatory problems.
That's a very interesting insight. Leona, unfortunately, we're near the end of our time, so I'm wondering, we're going to have to extend this conversation to another podcast or two, because you've got some great insights for the anti-corruption compliance practitioner from a wide variety of areas: safety, quality, regulatory compliance. So we'll have to think about those. But before we leave today, if someone wanted to follow up with you, how could they get in touch with you?
They can get in touch with me by email at Leona, Leona, Lewis, Lewis, that's one word, Leona, Lewis, at complyethic.com. So it's COMPLYETHIC.com.
And what's your website?
My website is www.complyethic.com. And that is COMPLYETHIC. Some people put the S on by mistake. There's no S. .com.
Well, thanks very much for taking the time to visit with us today, and we look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you. This was great.